This is a 1990 Ferrari 348. In the Ferrari world, the 348 isn't very well regarded, with many purists mocking its mediocre styling and uninspiring performance. It's quite literally the middle child between the old school and increasingly well-loved 308 and the 328 that came before it, and the higher performance cars that came later, like the F430. For that reason, it's also the least expensive of Ferrari's entire V8 line, which has been on sale in 8 generations for 40 years. And today, I'm going to tell you why the 348 doesn't quite deserve the reputation that it has. To do this, I've borrowed this 348 from Performance Auto Wholesalers here in Miami, Florida, which is an exotic car dealership that has a rather cool inventory of some nice enthusiast cars. That includes this one, which is a pretty nice 348 as 348s go. It has 39,000 miles, which is high for a 348, but it recently had its belt service done. We'll get back to the belt service in just a minute. It's also for sale for less than $60,000, which is incredible for a stick-shift classic Ferrari. A few years ago, these things were selling for $40,000, and while they've appreciated a little bit in price since then, they haven't kept pace with other Ferrari models, like the 355, the later version of this, which is rapidly becoming a $100,000 car, and the 308 and the 328, which are already surpassing that figure. First, I'm going to show you around the 348, and I'm going to show you all of its cool quirks and its weird features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and show you the part of the 348 that I think is the most underappreciated. That would be its driving experience. And then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And of course, for more of my thoughts on the 348, click the link below to go to autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of other older cars that don't deserve the bad reputation they've acquired. I'll start on the outside with a feature you just can't not discuss when you're talking 348, and that would be its horn. And since it was designed in the 80s, another feature the 348 of course has is pop-up headlights. Now, when you first look at this 348, two things you notice right away. Number one is that the roof is black. That's because this was a 348 TS, which meant that it had a Targa roof that can be lifted off when you want an open-air experience and put back when you want a coupe. There was also the 348 TB, which was a full coupe, and the 348 Spider, which had a normal soft top that opened and closed. The other thing you notice is the side strakes. Welcome to cars designed in the 1980s. The Ferrari Testarossa, which was the flagship model when this car was sold, is famous for its side strakes, but this car had them too. The cheese graters on the side that allowed air to pass into the engine through holes in the doors. They're very strange by modern standards, but they were very Ferrari and Lamborghini at the time this car came out. Now, speaking of those side strakes, one of the things I always found strangest about this car was they didn't just have the side strakes and the strakes over the engine cover, they also had strakes on the tail lights, which greatly diminished the ability to actually see the brake lights and the turn signals because there were these giant lines going across them. I don't know why Ferrari did that, and on a very later version of the 348, they finally removed it, as it should have been from day one. But for every really strange decision Ferrari makes, they also seem to get at least one thing right. In this case, I'm talking about the hood release. In most cars, you pull the interior hood release, and you have to go back there and fumble with an annoying latch. In this car, you pull the interior hood release, and it opens right up like it's automatic. That is smart thinking, unless you accidentally pull it while you're driving down the road. Next up, it's impossible to discuss 348 exterior design without talking about the wheels, which were almost identical to the wheels that appeared on the original Jeep Grand Cherokee. Take a look at those wheels. They are virtually the same. Now, I admit that I think the wheels in this car are too happy, not aggressive enough, but Ferrari does have a tradition of making 5-spoke wheels, and it's important to point out that the wheels on the Grand Cherokee came out much later. This car came out in 1989. The Grand Cherokee didn't come out with these same wheels until 1992. So it was Jeep that copied Ferrari and not the other way around. Next up, now in a new location with a G-Wagon behind me because of rain, let's talk about the 348's front grille. If you look closely, you'll find something interesting about the front grille. It looks like a grille, it seems like a grille, but it isn't. It's completely fake. There's nothing behind it. This car, the engine in the back, it didn't need a front grille, but Ferrari put one there anyway because they thought it would look weird if it didn't have one. And since we're up front, we gotta talk about the trunk in this car, which is front hinged rather than a rear hinge, so it opens to the front, which means you can't access it in the front. You have to access it on the sides, which is a little unusual for a trunk. Now, once you get inside the trunk, trunk, you'll find a couple of interesting things in here. One of them is the cover for the fuse box and a couple other things. They're pretty normal. They're finished in the regular carpeting you find inside the trunk, but the cool thing is that the screws that hold them in place have the prancing horse logo on them. That's oddly good Ferrari attention to detail. The other really cool thing I found in the trunk of this one is the logbook with all of the service records, and I mean all of the service records. For example, check this out. This is the original window sticker from when this car was sold new by Steve Harris Imports, the Ferrari dealer in Salt Lake City. That is a far cry from the price of a brand new Ferrari today. There's also a recall letter in here from 1992 for this car and just an enormous amount of service records, including the original temporary license plate from when this car was bought new in 1991 in Utah. I have seen a lot of binders with a lot of service records, but I've never seen one quite as complete as this, especially for a plebeian Ferrari like the 348. It is a trip down memory lane to look in here and see all this stuff. Another cool quirk, this car has a normal fuel door, just like most cars. It's accessed by pushing a button inside the car, but the interesting thing about this fuel door is it also comes with a fuel flap that you can roll out when you're getting gas so you don't get fuel on your Ferrari's beautiful fender. Next up, let's talk getting in this thing. If you look at it, you'll see there's just a button there, not a regular door handle, so you might think there's some weird trick you have to do to get inside. Not really. All you gotta do is push the button and then reach your hand underneath into the little side strake where there's an extra piece of metal designed for you to do just that. Next up, we gotta talk about one of the 348's most interesting quirks, one of the most interesting quirks of 80s Ferraris in general, and that is the automatic seatbelts. Now, I grew up in cars with these seatbelts, but most people don't know about them or they don't remember them, and so here's the way it worked. In the late 80s and the early 90s, the government mandated that all cars had to have either dual airbags or these weird automatic 3-point seatbelts. When you opened the door to get in the car, the seatbelt would retract down a track that was very loud to allow you entry into the vehicle. So then you climbed in, the seatbelt was here, you were here, you put it over yourself, and so you had one component of a 3-point belt. Then you took the normal old lap belt, you belted yourself in with the lap belt, then you close the door and this watches the seatbelt retracts automatically down its track to close me in and provide me with a true seatbelt experience. And that is how the weird automatic belts in the Ferrari 348 and the Testarossa and other cars of this era worked. When you wanted to get out, you open the door and the seatbelt would retract again, giving you room to get out. You would unlatch your normal lap belt, climb over the belt, and then you'd get out, and then when you shut the door, it would retract again down its track and go back into its home. Truthfully though, most people just unbuckle them and put them away because they were incredibly annoying, and instead they just used the regular lap belt, which is what I'm gonna do when I drive this thing. Now, although the automatic seatbelts might seem like one of the 348's strangest quirks, it was a fairly normal feature at the time. And there's a lot of other things in here that are a lot stranger. Starting, for example, with the bright orange gauges in the gauge cluster and in the center control stack. They also use this crazy 80s font. Combine the bright orange and the 80s font, and I think those things date this car more than anything else, even those crazy side strakes. In the center console, I love the fact that to unlock and lock the doors, there are two separate buttons, both the same shape and size and relatively the same location. So you have to look to make sure you're doing it right. The one to lock it has a key on it, which is nice, but I really like the unlock one, which has a little door lock in the up position. That leaves no question as to which is which. Now, speaking of the door locks, when you're inside this car, you might be wondering how to unlatch the door so you can get out. Interestingly, there's no relatively obvious latch on the inside of the door like in virtually every other car. Instead, on the grab handle that you would grab if you're going really fast, you pull the top of that and that unlatches the door. Another interesting thing, when you get in this car, you realize there's no dome light up here in the normal place. Where would the dome light be? Well, it turns out it's actually behind you. They put it behind the seats on the ceiling in the car, and there's a regular dome light with a dome light control, and there's also a little light that you can change directions and get it to shine where you especially want it to. Now, one of the interesting things about the Targa Top 348, like this one, is that when you pull off the Targa Top, you don't have to leave it wherever you were. There's a place to stow it inside the car. You move the seats forward a little bit, which isn't good for tall drivers if they want to drive with the roof off, and you'll find anchors where you can latch the Targa Top in so it sticks in place and it won't move around while you're driving. Like I said, this does compromise your leg room a little bit since you have to move the seats forward to do it, but at least you get a lot more headroom out of it. Another interesting item in the interior of this car is the placement of the radio. Now, a quick glance at the center controls would show you that there is no radio, but if you flip up a secret leather compartment that says 348 TS on it, you will find that's where the radio is. Interestingly, in order to listen to the radio and change it, you have to have that compartment flipped up at all times. Another interesting feature of this car is the fact that when you open the doors, there are little red lights on the back of the inside of the doors that come on, presumably to let other drivers know that you're there. Some cars have reflectors here, this one has lights. It's an odd feature, but also it kind of makes sense if you think about it, if you're parking on a narrow street. Ferrari is this weird amalgamation of sensible and strange. The final interesting interior quirk in this car is the parking brake. Now, I've shown parking brakes with this weird design before, but it's been a while, so in case you haven't seen one of those videos, here it is again. Right now the parking brake is on, but it's down. If you want to pull the parking brake off, you first have to lift it up, then push the button in, and now it's off. I want to put it back on, pull it back up, and then they allow you to put it down so that you can get in and out easier. So now the parking brake is on, but it looks like it's off. It kind of takes some getting used to, but once you figure it out, it's actually a pretty smart design that helps with getting in and out of the car. So those are all the uniquely Italian features and quirks of the 348. Now it's time to get it out on the road. And if you don't know much about the 348, it has a 300 horsepower 3.4 liter V8, hence the name. It does 0 to 60 in about 5.6 seconds, and it'll hit a top speed of 171 miles an hour. Now on to the road. All right, driving the 348. Now I know this car gets a lot of crap, but I've always thought the thing that distinguishes this car, the driving experience. The thing I like about the 348 driving experience is it's tossable. You can throw it around. It actually accelerates fairly quickly. The low-end acceleration is better than you'd expect. It takes some work to drive it well. The clutch is heavy, but I think it's fun. The Testarossa clutch is heavy too. I mean, the F40 clutch is heavy. Like, that's this world of Ferrari. I noticed that headroom maybe could be a little improved. These didn't have adjustable anything, although you can adjust the steering column, which is surprisingly, but only up and down. It won't, not forward and backward, so you better kind of hope you're already in the right position. The seat I can move forward and backward, but I can't lower it, so this is kind of the extent of what you get. This one is obviously pretty nice, and the packet of service records, when they showed that to me at the dealer this morning, I flipped out. I've never seen, it has the original temporary license, but I've never seen anything like that before. But it's been really well kept. And sitting here at idle, this car is just very smooth. It doesn't shake or anything. I love driving this car because it really feels like a go-kart. And I feel that when I'm driving the Testarossa, but I really feel that in this car because it's even smaller than the Testarossa. It isn't the fastest Ferrari, there's no doubt about that. It's not a very fast car, but we like the Miata that's not a very fast car, and we like the BRZ that's not a very fast car. And this is a fun car. The engine is right back there making all this noise, and the interior is not so old and outdated that it's just ugly and stupid, and the handling is good. I swear this car handles well. It just annoys me so much that the 348 has never taken off and that people knock it so much because it's not a bad car. I've always felt this car was really kind of fun to drive. The air conditioning in this car works like stunningly well. It's keeping me nice and cold, which is nice in Florida in the summer. You gotta force the gate into gear, you know, and you're pushing that heavy clutch, but it's fun, and it isn't as compromised as some exotic cars from this era. I mean, I can see. I look around and I can see. Now, I understand why the NSX got so popular. You know, this car it was more expensive to maintain, to own, to run, but it's still a Ferrari and it's still fun to drive. My hair is getting a little bit of a new style today because of the 348. Wouldn't want to be at a rollover in this car. I'm gonna give it a little gas here. Pretty good. I mean, look, it sounds great, and it's reasonably quick. I mean, I'm not gonna lie and say, oh, it's the lightning, it's incredibly fast, blah, blah, blah. Now, granted, I'm passing a GTI, and he's probably faster than I am, but that's also true of 308, and Testarossa isn't exactly an ultra-fast car, especially by modern standards. When you ask a normal person who's never driven one of these cars, oh, what do you think of the 348? Oh, that ugly 90s Ferrari, wasn't the NSX better than that stupid Ferrari? Well, get behind the wheel. If you have the opportunity to ever drive one of these, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. This car just feels still so connected, and even the modern Ferraris, they handle better, but they just don't feel quite as connected. They all have this electric steering and all that, and all these exotic cars have that stuff now, and you know, you lose what this car had. And that's why a lot of these older Ferraris are shooting up in value, the Testarossa, blah, blah, blah. But it's all left the 348 behind, and I swear it doesn't deserve that. So that's the 348. It's your typical Italian car when it comes to weird quirks and strange features, and it's your typical Italian car when you get it out on the road and you want to have fun. Unfortunately, it's also your typical Italian car when it comes to maintenance. Yes, this is the part where we talk about the belt service. Every 3 years, the engine of this car has to come out for the regular service where they change the belts. Now, a lot of Ferrari owners stretch this to 5 years, but the point remains, it's a major service. In fact, they call it the major service, and it can cost up to $10,000, which is a hefty chunk of change for a car that costs somewhere between 50 to 60. But here's the thing, the 355, which is the successor to this, the 348, and which is becoming more and more valuable, also has that same engine out belt service. And it has a lot of other costly problems, which are described in my 355 video, which I've linked in the description below, that the 348 doesn't have. So considering that this car has sort of baby Testarossa styling and all the unique quirks and features that we've come to expect from an Italian car, and considering the performance is relatively decent, the driving experience is relatively fun, and considering that, well, it's a Ferrari, don't you think it deserves a little bit of a better reputation than it has? Anyway, on to the Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, this car is attractive, better than average, but its 80s design hasn't yet reached the era where we all think it's gorgeous, so it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration, it does 0 to 60 in 5.6 seconds, giving it a 4 out of 10. Handling is good. It's as sharp and as crisp as any car from this era can be, but it's obviously not quite up to modern standards. Still, it earns a respectable 6 out of 10. Cool factor is subjective, but you never see 348s, and to me, they're a way more interesting sight at Cars and Coffee than an F430, which is pretty common, so it gets a 7 out of 10. As for importance, a Ferrari, no matter how unloved, will always do well in this category because Ferrari models always have high intrinsic value. This one earns a 7 out of 10, bringing its total weekend score to 30 out of 50, placing it just below the rest of the sports car pack. Moving on to the daily categories, where the 348 likely won't fare so well, first up is features, which measures cars based on the standards of today. And while the 348 has everything you'll need, it doesn't have any sort of futuristic technology, so it earns a 3 out of 10. Luxury measures comfort, and the 348 isn't a comfortable car. Steering is heavy, the ride is harsh, and my hair was getting rearranged by the roof. Still, it isn't unlivable or painful, so it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality measures reliability and materials. Materials are good, especially for its day, with leather basically everywhere, but quality isn't so good. A routine service that requires the removal of the engine for thousands of dollars, it earns an average 5 out of 10 here. Next up is practicality. The 348 has 8.1 cubic feet of cargo space, giving it a 3 out of 10. Finally, value. This car outperforms its predecessors and offers baby Testarossa styling for half the money. It's also pretty fun to throw around, even if it isn't the fastest or most reliable Ferrari. It earns a 7 out of 10 for being the bargain of the Ferrari V8 world. That gives it a daily score of 22 out of 50, near the bottom, but that makes sense. This wasn't intended to be a great daily driver. Add it all up, and the total Doug score is 52 out of 100. Not great, but not so bad for the so-called black sheep of the Ferrari family.